All right, everyone, get ready, because it's time for another deep dive.
That's right. Today we're tackling a topic packed with misconceptions.
Yeah, you guys sent in this really interesting article about common myths surrounding the Middle Ages.
It's amazing how these myths just stick around, right?
Totally, like they become part of how we picture history.
Exactly. And this article does a great job picking them apart.
So let's get into it. First up, the flat Earth.
Ah, yes, the classic.
I mean, come on, did people really believe that back then?
You'd be surprised how often that one pops up. But the article sets the record straight.
Lay it on me.
Educated folks in the Middle Ages, they knew the Earth was a sphere. It wasn't a secret.
Really? So where'd they get that idea from?
Ancient Greece, thinkers like Aristotle, Ptolemy, their work was like the foundation.
Wow, so it's like that knowledge got passed down through the ages?
Exactly. It was preserved, studied, built upon.
That's pretty neat.
And we see evidence of that in the writings of some big medieval thinkers, too.
Oh, yeah. Like, who are we talking about?
Thomas Aquinas, for one,
Oh, wow, yeah, the philosopher.
huge figure, and he wrote about the Earth as a sphere.
Huh, the more you know.
And then there's Roger Bacon, a scientist, also a proponent of the spherical Earth model.
Okay, so this wasn't just some fringe theory. It was actually pretty mainstream knowledge.
Pretty much, at least in the scholarly circles. But that brings up an interesting point about knowledge in the Middle Ages.
What's that?
It's not always this neat linear progression. Just because an idea exists doesn't mean everyone knows about it, right?
It believes it, even.
Exactly. So while some folks might still picture those medieval flat earthers.
They've got it all wrong.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've busted the flat Earth myth. What's next on the list?
How about the term Dark Ages? It's literally in the name.
Yeah, it's not the most positive image, right? Paints a pretty bleak picture.
And the article takes issue with that, and rightfully so.
Why is that?
Well, the term Dark Ages, it implies that there wasn't much going on. It sort of flattens the whole era, doesn't do justice to the advancements and complexities of the time.
So it's not exactly accurate.
Not really. It's way too simplistic.
Okay, so if the Dark Ages weren't actually so dark, what were some of the bright spots?
Agriculture is a great example.
Really? Farming.
Yeah. Believe it or not, the Middle Ages saw some serious innovation in farming techniques.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, there's the heavy plow, for one. Then you've got crop rotation. Oh, and we can't forget the horse collar.
A horse collar. What's so special about that?
It revolutionized how people used animals for labor. Before the horse collar, oxen were the go-to, but they're slower and need more food. Horses are faster and more efficient, but the old harnesses would choke them. The horse collar changed the game entirely.
That's wild. So we're talking major advancements in agriculture, but those must have had a ripple effect beyond just, more food on the table.
Absolutely, think about it. More food means a growing population, bigger and more vibrant towns and cities. These changes even played a role in the rise of new social classes.
It's all connected, isn't it?
Yeah.
Innovations in one area lead to huge changes across society. Okay, next myth up. Short lifespans. I feel like everyone just assumes people dropped dead at 30 back then.
It's a common misconception for sure.
So what's the reality? Were people really dropping dead left and right?
Not quite. While the average lifespan was shorter, it's largely skewed by the high rate of infant and child mortality.
Oh, right. That makes sense. Kids were a lot more vulnerable back then.
Exactly. If you made it past childhood, your chances of living a good long life were much higher.
So basically, surviving those early years was the biggest hurdle. Once you clear that, you were good to go.
Pretty much.
Makes sense. Speaking of surviving, let's talk about torture. Whenever I think of the Middle Ages, I picture those gruesome torture devices. Racks, Iron Maidens, the whole shebang.
It's a vivid image, isn't it? And a bit misleading. The article had a fascinating fact about those torture devices.
Wait, don't tell me. They weren't as common as we think.
You got it. Many of those infamous devices we associate with the Middle Ages, they were actually invented much later.
Get out of here. Seriously.
I know, right? It seems counterintuitive, but some of them might have even been fabricated as tourist attractions.
Wait, people were selling torture devices as souvenirs.
It seems crazy, but it speaks to the power of these myths and how we choose to remember the past.
Wow. Talk about a dark souvenir.
For sure.
Okay, next up on the myth-busting list. Chivalrous knights. Everyone loves the image of the knight in shining armor, always there to save the damsel in distress.
The classic hero, right?
But how accurate is that image? Were knights really the epitome of chivalry?
That's a good one. And like a lot of myths, there's a grain of truth to it, but it's definitely been romanticized over time.
So, less rescuing damsels, more what?
Well, the article doesn't sugarcoat it. It points out that many knights were, to put it bluntly, more like armed thugs.
Whoa, really? That's quite a different image.
Yeah, but you have to remember they were powerful, often wealthy, and they didn't always play by the rules. Chivalry might have been the ideal, but the reality was often much messier.
That makes sense. There's always a gap between those idealized versions of the past and the actual lived experiences of people back then.
Exactly.
All right, moving on from knights to something a little less glamorous,
Yeah.
hygiene. Let's be honest, most people probably picture the Middle Ages as one big, smelly mess.
What's a common stereotype?
Were they really that anti-hygiene?
Not at all. In fact, the article mentions that public bathhouses were incredibly popular during the Middle Ages.
Public bathhouses? Really? I had no idea.
Yep. So not only were people aware of hygiene, but they also had systems in place to, well, keep things clean.
So much for that smelly stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, last myth I got to ask about.
Mm-hmm.
Science versus religion. Was everyone in the Middle Ages anti-science? Was the church totally against new ideas?
That's another one of those oversimplifications that get thrown around. While the church did clash with some scientific theories, especially those that challenged their doctrines.
Which makes sense. They were trying to uphold their beliefs.
Exactly. But we can't forget that the church was also a huge supporter of learning and education. Remember all those universities that popped up in the Middle Ages? Many were founded by the church.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So it wasn't all just blind faith and dogma. They were fostering intellectual curiosity, too.
Precisely. It's a good reminder that history is rarely black and white. Institutions, even powerful ones, are complex.
Totally. Okay, this one's a bit more lighthearted. Bland food. Everyone seems to think medieval cuisine was all gruel and bread. Was it really as bland as everyone says?
Well, that depends. If you were wealthy, you had access to a surprising variety of flavors. Think spices from the East, elaborate recipes.
Hold on, spices. So they weren't just eating plain porridge all day.
Not the wealthy ones, at least. They were feasting on some pretty extravagant stuff.
It just goes to show you, right? Even back then, food wasn't just fuel. It was an expression of culture, and for some, a status symbol. All right, last myth to debunk, and this is a big one. The role of women in the Middle Ages. Were they really as powerless and isolated as we often imagine?
That's a stereotype that needs some serious challenging, and the article does a good job of that.
Tell me more.
Women in the Middle Ages absolutely had agency and influence. Were there limitations placed on them? Sure. But they found ways to navigate those constraints and leave their mark.
So they were definitely not just silent bystanders. Were there any women in particular that stood out?
Absolutely. The article mentions Hildegard von Bingen, a remarkable figure.
Okay, tell me everything about her.
She was a Benedictine abbess, for one, but she was also a composer, a writer, a philosopher, a physician. This woman did it all.
Wow, talk about a polymath. She sounds incredible.
She was way ahead of her time. She advised popes and kings, wrote extensively on medicine, botany, theology.
Hildegard von Bingen definitely deserves her own deep dive someday.
Agreed.
Okay, but what about this idea of women being isolated? Was there really no interaction with the outside world?
Not at all. Remember, this was a period of extensive trade routes, pilgrimages, even the Crusades. All of these things brought people and cultures together.
So, more interconnected than we give them credit for. This has been amazing. So many busted myths. What do you think is the biggest takeaway from all of this?
I think it highlights how important it is to approach history, any period really, with a critical and open mind. The Middle Ages, for instance, were so much more than just knights and dragons.
Uh-huh. You're telling me. Although more dragons would definitely spice things up a bit.
Maybe.
But seriously, this has really changed how I think about this whole period.
That's what we like to hear. Remember, this is just scratching the surface. There's a whole world of medieval history out there to explore. What piqued your interest today? What are you going to go research now?